Hello, this is Tika Dhasal from Kathmandu, Nepal. I'm associated currently with European Institute of Peace South Asia, and I'm also formerly a lecturer of political science with Tribhuvan University. It is a great honor to be speaking before you today. In the next 20 plus minutes, I will be speaking about the process of democratization in Nepal. I sincerely thank the May 18 Foundation for providing me this wonderful opportunity. Democracy as a form of government and a discipline of political interest is as old as human civilization. It is in fact one of Plato's 5 types of regimes. But democratization as an academic field of study comes across as a very recent phenomenon which could be traced barely as far back as the 1960s. Democratization in a broad sense is understood as a process of transition towards more open, participatory and plural form of polity from a closed and authoritarian government. It is further defined in connotation with its emancipatory values that require renewal through legitimate popular endorsements at regular intervals. Theoretically, the framework of democratization includes 2 primary issues. The first one deals with the transformation of political structures into democratic systems, and the second with policies and institutions designed for the sustainability of democracy. They are interlinked and mutually reinforcing. The first looks more at the macro structures such as the constitution, separation of powers, arrangement of free and fair competition, universal suffrage, basic individual freedoms, etc. The policy domain, which is the second aspect, involves microanalysis of liberal governments, expanding as wide as to the possibility of inclusive political and socio-economic institution, political party financing, corruption control, affirmative action, and a just international order, among others. It is indeed a very big deal. But I want to keep it small in this lecture today. My objective is to briefly explore Nepal's democratization process from the window of direct citizen participation to trace the development of the many political changes in Nepal. These changes have taken place in the span of last 70 years. I'm focusing only at the structural changes that occurred in the process of democratization. I beg your pardon for not being able to investigate the policy aspects, which I think would also be boring for you. Democracy, it is said, and you are aware of it, tends to be monotonous when it meanders into the areas of policy. The devil of the detail drains our energy and gusto when we enter the maze of micro-elements. Therefore, I would limit myself looking into the changes of political systems, also presenting my arguments that these changes have contributed to the democratization process of Nepal. The instrument of these changes is the collective action of the people. You may also call it people power in a more commonly used parlance. As it is often said about South Korea, it may be also said about my country, Nepal, that it has gone through enormous political transformation in a relatively short span of time. For the ease of summary, I arrange them this way: 70 years, 7 constitutions, 4 kinds of political systems, including 2 military-backed coup d'etats, 10 years of violent conflict, 2 constituent assemblies elected by the people, bloodless founding of the republic, 2 primary political parties. While there have been many political parties, only 2 of them have a history running parallel to one another, from 1940s to now actually. 3 generations of leadership, and in average 1 government a year in the last 30 years with no prime minister, completing the full 5-year tenure in the entire period of 70 years. Isn't this amazing? In fact, because of this, it is said that political literacy among the people in Nepal runs quite high. These changes, as I mentioned before, on the one hand, brought about much sought after civil liberties for the people or quashed them at times. On the one hand, they also resulted into unstable polity and intermittent transitions from autocracy to democracy and vice versa. The biggest thing that the history of Nepal's democratization process informs is this: do not take the muzzling of freedoms lying down. Rise up and fight to snatch them back from the rulers. That's why we also say Nepal undergoes street uprisings every 10 years in an average. Last 14 years have been exception to this crude empirical rule. At present, there is a pervading sense of incompleteness of change, but there is also a feeling of exhaustion. The constitution, drafted and promulgated in 2015 by the popularly elected Constituent Assembly, has transformed Nepal into a federal, democratic, secular and inclusive republic from the previous unitary Hindu kingdom. Faster pace of development, more people to be lifted from the abject poverty, better healthcare, education and shelter is what people are looking forward to. The progress in these areas is much slower than expected, but I must admit there is some progress. I started from 2015. Before coming back to it, let me take you all the way back to 1951, the year when democracy had first dawned to Nepal. Until then, Nepal was governed by an autocratic Rana family oligarchy for 104 years. British India, firmly standing at the guarantor of the Rana family interest, the oligarchy enjoyed unlimited clout. Nepal was a monarchy, but the powers of the king were in practice exercised by Rana prime ministers, who also inherited their office like the king. In absence of constitution and law, the Rana prime ministers were ultimate source of state power. This was indeed a worse form of tyranny. Opposition to the Rana regime started emerging in the 1930s, initially without success. Many Nepalese youths were living in India either as political exiles or as students. They participated in India's independence movement against British colonialism, realizing that only after the riddance of the British support would the Rana regime fall. With an objective of launching protest against the Ranas, these Nepalese youths formed two separate political parties, the Nepali Congress under the popular leadership of B.P. Koirala and the Nepal Communist Party under Pushpalal. Nepali Congress led the first ever mass protests in Nepal, which abolished Rana regime and introduced the first ever democratic constitution in 1951. This was an interim constitution drafted according to the Delhi Agreement among the Ranas, Nepali Congress and the king to set the next political course for Nepal. That course would proceed with formation of interim government, election to the Constituent Assembly, certain constitutional powers of the king as the head of the state and abolition of Rana regime. This first ever democratic experiment was fraught with instability. Election to the Constituent Assembly never took place. 6 prime ministers came and went until 1959, when the King Mahendra announced general elections and then promulgated a new constitution. Nepali Congress won 2/3 majority in parliament, with B.P. Koirala taking office as the first ever democratically elected prime minister. This constitution was democratic in form, but the king retained certain powers which he could exercise without the consent of the prime minister or parliament. Most importantly, the king kept control over the army. He also had emergency powers which granted him authority of suspending all or part of the constitution. Democracy would carry on only as long as the king stayed quiet. But the king would soon grow politically ambitious. In 1962, he staged a soft coup with the military backing, arrested sitting Prime Minister B.P. Koirala and imprisoned him. Elected parliament was dissolved in less than 3 years. The king soon brought another constitution which banned all political parties. This new political change was named partyless Panchayat system. Periodic elections of Panchayat units took place from villages to the unicameral national parliament. But it was not a democracy because basic freedoms of expression and political organization were impossible. Nepal's two neighbors, India and China, engulfed in a bloody border war in 1962, had their different priorities. India naturally had a pro-democracy orientation, but was left with no choice other than to support the king, ostensibly to stop Chinese advance. China, indifferent about whatever happens to Nepalese democracy, also supported the king's move, anticipating political stability. In this environment, the Nepali Congress and Nepal Communist Party continued their secretive activities for the restoration of democracy. This included expanding their party organization to the nooks and corners of the country, and at the same time, government suppression of pro-democracy movement deepened. Under the wrath of Panchayat, several leaders exiled in India, among whom was B.P. Koirala, after he was released from 8 years of imprisonment. Puspalal was also in India. It was during this period the second generation of Nepali Congress leaders like Ganesh Man Singh, Girija Prasad Koirala, Krishna Prasad Bhattarai began organizing people. The Communist Party also witnessed rejuvenation under young leaders, and I name them Madan Bhandari, C.P. Mainali, and K.P. Sarma Oli, among others. Political parties were prohibited by law, but these leaders were secretly organizing students, peasants, and intellectuals all over the country, preparing for another movement. Constant work of political parties informed people and took the flames of democracy to the villages and far-flung areas of the country. The results of this would be seen in 1980. Large student protests took place all over the country, demanding restoration of democracy, forcing King Birendra to announce a referendum asking people if they preferred multi-party democracy over the Panchayat system with some reforms. While the pro-democracy leaders were restricted from canvassing for their position in public, the Panchayat system used state powers to influence the outcome of elections. Panchayat eventually won, but no reforms as promised by the king ever took place. It was during this period Madan Bhandari, the revolutionary communist leader, drove his party among the masses as an alternative to armed rebellion as opposed to the hardline communists advocated. Bhandari believed in joint work with Nepali Congress to have any realistic chance of the restoration of democracy. While his party reached out to the teachers, students, peasants and women for organization, he also started negotiating with Nepali Congress leader Ganesh Man Singh for joint mass movement. This made possible the 1990 joint protests led by Congress and communist forces. Unlike in the past, when few townships were seen as the center of political uprisings, these protests escalated from countrysides and districts, finally pushing capital Kathmandu to rise. The movement won back democracy from the king, vested sovereignty in the people and restored multi-party parliamentary democracy. New democratic constitution was promulgated immediately after the success of the movement. With general elections in 1991, Democratic Government of Nepali Congress, led by Girija Prasad Koirala, initiated policies of economic liberalization. Education up to grade 10th was made universal and free. Big infrastructure got a boost. In 1994 midterm elections, Communist Party of Nepal, unified Marxist and Leninist, formed a minority government under the premiership of Manmohan Adhikari. Following the ideology of people's multi-party democracy developed by his younger colleague Madan Bhandari, who had died a year before the elections, Prime Minister Adhikari launched a slew of social welfare policies ranging from direct financing of the local bodies to old age allowances. Under this government, it was made sure that each of the 4,000 local governments of Nepal would have at least a sub-health post, thus taking the basic health care to the people. The country's annual economic growth rate kept around a healthy 5% from 1991 to 1995. But this would not last long. Absence of majority to a single party in parliament degenerated democratic exercise. Horse tradings took place in parliament. Change of governments in less than 1 year, slower progress of big infrastructure, and mounting corruption post-Adhikari government gave way to the rise of Maoist armed insurgency starting in 1996. It is always questionable whether an armed rebellion for a political cause was necessary, particularly when the prevailing constitution guaranteed political organization and periodic elections. The Maoist party aimed at abolishing the constitutional monarchy and multi-party democracy and wanted to establish a North Korea-style communist people's republic. This was naturally unacceptable to a large majority of people who had already tasted openness of democracy. The Maoist party, on the one hand, fought with state security forces, and on the other hand, it started physically eliminating Congress and UML cadres who would counter to the Maoist ideas. So pro-democracy political parties were weakened, particularly during the period of 2000 and 2005. In 2002, you are very well aware that the entire family of King Birendra was murdered in a gunfire in the royal palace. New King Gyanendra then took power and suspended the constitution. Democracy was to be fought back again. After 10 years of the armed insurgency and with over 17,000 deaths and thousands of other injured or displaced, the Maoists realized that defeating the Nepali state would not be possible. Negotiations between pro-democracy parties and Maoists finally arrived at a compromise which is called the 12-point understanding. Accordingly, the Maoists would no longer pursue the founding of communist state. The pro-democracy parties led by Nepali Congress and CPN-UML would not stand to support the constitutional monarchy. Both sides also agreed to elect a constituent assembly for drafting a new constitution to ensure a federal democratic republic of Nepal. Soon after, mass protests erupted all over the country, following which the king reinstated the parliament to pave way for the entry of the Maoists to the democratic mainstream. An interim government was formed under Nepali Congress leader, former Prime Minister Girija Prasad Koirala. He signed the comprehensive peace agreement with the Maoists. This document began the peace process in Nepal. This document also largely laid out the framework of New Nepal. Maoist party participated in the interim government. Elections to the Constituent Assembly on the basis of universal suffrage took place in 2008. On its failure to draft the promised constitution in 4 years, another assembly was elected in 2013, which successfully drafted and promulgated the new constitution on 3rd September 2015. Thus, the Constituent Assembly, which was promised to the people in 1950, immediately after the fall of the Rana regime that we discussed above, came to be possible almost 60 years later. We in Nepal believe that the democratization process has completed a full circle, abolishing feudal chain of power. We now look forward to moving towards socialist democracy as directed by the new constitution. In Nepal, we say now that the fight for political rights is over and we must strive towards economic progress with an orientation to socialism. Please don't be alarmed here. Socialism in Nepal, our understanding and interpretation does not come with an authoritarian tilt. By this, Nepal aims to become a true welfare state with freedoms of the people guaranteed as per the ideals of universal human rights. The government elected in 2017 under the new constitution has a possibility of completing the full 5-year term. If this happens, this would be the first ever democratically elected government to achieve this, giving a message of political stability. This government, led by Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli, has prioritized larger infrastructure, railways, and connectivity with both India and China. Social justice and job creation is also focused. Nepal's economy has considerably expanded over the last 3 years with annual growth rate around 7%. You are all aware of the large earthquake of Nepal in 2015. People and government of South Korea stood by us at the time of this difficulty. I thank you for this. Let me tell you, building back better is in its last phase now. 90% of the private houses, public buildings and historic sites damaged by the earthquake have been already rebuilt. Nepal has graduated this year to become a lower middle income country. Number of households living below the national poverty line has come down to 17% now from 25% some 5 years ago. An aspirational young population is the driving engine of Nepal. Looking towards the future, this makes me optimistic, but there are enormous challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic causes a huge national distress to Nepal as it does to the globe. Until now, there are over 100 deaths and 25,000 infections recorded, with about 10,000 active cases. This is the data from 14th August. Constraint of resources comes in our way, fighting this invisible enemy. At the same time, the gap between promise and delivery of the government is a huge challenge. Big reforms in government administration, corruption control, and ensuring transparency of political party financing are extremely crucial. Before I complete, I must mention here, democratic transformation is a continuous process. It does not stop at a certain point. No democracy in the world is complete either. Above all, inclusive democratic institutions keep a democracy going despite its shortcomings. I thank you all for your patience. Thank you, Korea. I've left my email with May 18 Foundation. I'm also on WhatsApp. If you have certain questions, you can direct those to me. I will really appreciate them. Thank you very much. Namaste.